During my time as a freelancer so far, I've often found this common theme where if I'm shooting with a camera like this, perhaps at a wedding or capturing general cutaway content on a corporate shoot, the turnover rate and the amount of shots that I need to capture and the variation in certain recording settings that I need to capture is much greater than when I'm using a higher end cinema line camera on set. But these types of mirrorless cameras especially, from Panasonic, Sony and others out there, have identified that people like us might need to access a variety of recording settings and might need them with little time to spare. That is where custom modes can be a lifesaver and arguably one of the most underrated features in a camera such as this one. So that's what this video is going to be about today. What custom modes are, how to use them and how they benefit camera operators and videographers just like you and I, and why you should be using them if you aren't already. Welcome back everybody, I hope you're having a cracking start to 2022. I appreciate that this video is going to be quite limited in terms of GV content given the fact that the topic is about a camera setting, so I'll try and keep this video as quick as possible and let's get straight to it. Custom modes or custom settings are a predefined user setting that you can create and adapt that takes into consideration the range of recording settings that you might need to change on a semi-regular basis depending on the type of shoot that you're on. By programming in advance what is essentially a template of your preferred shooting settings for you to access quickly when you need it, you're essentially skipping out the boring part of setting up your camera, allowing you to get out there and start shooting even quicker. If your camera allows a number of custom modes like this, the GH5, the Lumix S1 which I'm shooting on now, or even other cameras like the Sony a7S III for example, you can pre-program your shooting modes to suit the type of shooting environment that you find yourself in. For example, a wedding videographer might typically have around 3 different recording setups that they need for the typical wedding day. One for your ceremony and speeches, which is likely to be in 24, 25 or 30 frames per second. Your general cutaway content, which could be at 50 or 60 frames a second, and that might be used for the majority of the day. And when there's opportunity to shoot a little bit of slow motion, perhaps for the confetti shot or your first dance, you might want to hop into the variable frame rate mode. If you're a vlogger on YouTube, you might have one recording setup or custom mode for when you're out and about vlogging in public. Your second custom mode might be when you're doing some cutaway content, again at 50 or 60 frames per second. And then your third custom mode could be for something like this when you're in your studio and doing pieces to camera. And finally, a corporate filmmaker may have a setup for interviews, a setup for general cutaway content, and then perhaps some gimbal work for that third and final custom mode. When you think about it, there isn't typically just one shooting setup that you're required to undertake on a typical shooting day, which is why having custom modes at your disposal can help you out big time. At this point, some of you may think that to change these settings, which more often than not might just be the recording format or the frame rate that you're shooting in, all it takes is to quickly hop into the menu, change the setting, or you could assign a custom button to quickly access the particular shortcut that you're after. You would be correct, but with a custom mode, all it takes is the flick of a switch and your settings are automatically adjusted and will be the same every time you enter that particular mode. All it takes is a different type of shoot to accidentally nudge a setting, whether that be exposure related, such as your ISO or your shutter speed, or something to do with the mechanical internal features of the camera like IBIS, and then suddenly you're at risk of incorrectly shooting at the best possible quality and standard that it can be. For example, if you're someone who likes to shoot in shutter speed rather than angle, or your camera doesn't have that angle feature, and if you're in a bit of a rush when changing from 25p to 50p, and you forget to adjust that shutter speed in line with that new frame rate, your settings are technically incorrect, and that could be picked up by either the editor or the director. But if you've pre-programmed your custom modes, for example, if C1 or the equivalent of C1 is set to 25p with a 1/50 shutter, and your C2 custom mode is set to 50p with a 1/100 shutter speed, you're sorted. The camera is doing the work for you and therefore eliminating any risk. Understandably, every now and again, as a camera operator, you'll find yourself in situations where you're unsure about the settings or the environment that you're going to be shooting in, such as the white balance or the exposure levels of that place. In instances like this, such as weddings or documentary style filmmaking, I'd advise you to just spend a little bit of time when you first turn up on the set or the shoot and conjure up a sense of the typical settings that you're likely to be using for the majority of that day. So if it's evident that you're going to be finding yourself in a lowly lit room that is lit by tungsten lighting, you could pre-program one of your custom modes set to 3200 Kelvin with a relatively high ISO. So you'll always be relatively more or less in line with the area of settings that you're going to need to perform that job. So what particular settings can you use in these custom mode setups? The answer is pretty much everything. Of course, you have your standard exposure settings such as your ISO and your shutter speed, but white balance, picture profiles, stabilization, on-screen displays such as your histogram and waveforms, your recording format, recording quality, crop features like X-Teleconvert, APS-C mode or Super 35 mode if you're on a Sony. God, I'm out of breath. They are all features that you can pre-program within your custom mode. I'll admit, when I first got the GH5, I didn't properly utilize custom modes for 1 or 2 years. But now that I have this camera set up to accommodate the variety of shooting situations that I'll find myself in, it saves me a load of time. To overwrite a custom setting or a mode on your camera, and I'll be using the S1 for the cutaways, it's pretty much exactly the same as your initial setup of the custom modes. I imagine this would probably be the case with most other cameras that aren't Panasonic or Sony. However, if it's not exactly the same, I'd be pretty positive that there would be an overwrite or a replace feature within that area of the menu. One thing worth mentioning is that you can of course change those default settings that form your custom mode. They're solely there to act as a benchmark and as a foundation for the environment that you'll be shooting in. So the closer you are to those settings, the easier it will be for you whilst on that shoot. However, naturally some of those settings will have to change throughout the course of the day or the shoot. One of the things with custom modes, and it can be seen as both an advantage and a disadvantage, is that if you hop out of a particular custom mode with a few tweaks that you might have made, it won't remember those settings once you hop back into it. So if you went from C1 to C2 to shoot some cutaway content, then went back to C1, it will revert back to the default settings and not factor in any of those exposure tweaks or anything that you might have done when you were previously in that custom mode, unless you saved those changes. Also, it will reset the settings if you turn the camera off and back on again. Just bear that in mind. So this is where fine-tuning those custom modes once you arrive on set can benefit you massively and for the remainder of the day. Alternatively, some cameras like the GH5 has a little button in the middle of the mode dial to lock that, so you can't physically move the mode dial across, so then you won't be taken out of that custom mode that you're in or any of the other modes that the camera has. Or as a final option, you can always revert back to the manual shooting mode if the default settings within your custom modes aren't going to be efficient enough for your style of shooting for that day. So what are the other benefits to using custom modes? The most important one is efficiency. Just like I said at the beginning of the video, it minimizes your chances of missing something. If you've just finished some filming, you need to change the settings, however long that takes for you to change those settings and everything to match it, like the shutter speed that we was on about earlier or the ISO, the amount of time it takes for you to make those changes, you could be missing something important. In fact, let's use my custom mode settings that I use on my S1 for wedding videography as an example for you guys. I have one of my custom modes set up for cutaway content at 50p. So for when the bride or groom is walking down the aisle, I like to shoot that at 50p so I can half speed that if I want. Then when they've reached the front of the aisle and there's that little bit of nothing before the ceremony actually begins, I'm walking back to my tripod, I'm changing the settings. Now with these custom modes, all I need to do is flick the switch and I've moved from 50p to 25p. I've also disabled the IBIS because that will save my battery life whilst it's on sticks. It doesn't need the IBIS to be enabled during the ceremony, and also my shutter speed or angle, because I do use angle, has been adjusted anyway. But if I was using just shutter speed, that can automatically be adjusted. And that is so much quicker and easier than heading into the menu of the camera whilst trying to walk in, a high pressure environment, changing the recording format, changing the shutter speed and everything else that I need to do. I could be missing something and the ceremony could have already started. The settings are correct. It's just like what I shoot with every other wedding that I do, and therefore there's consistency in the work that I'm producing. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the exact settings. If you'd like a video on the best settings that I use for wedding videography, that can always be done in another video. But as a general overview, what I do is make sure that all of my 3 custom modes are set to the same picture profile. They have IBIS enabled when I need them to, and then with the exposure, what I do is I set the ISO to match the level of exposure that's in line with the other custom modes. So if I'm at 400 ISO when I'm shooting at 25p, when I go to 50p, because I've lost a stop in light, I will bump the ISO from 400 to 800, as a starting point. It reduces the chance of making a technical mistake within the camera as well. So if you have a custom mode set up particularly for gimbal work, then it's probably best to disable the internal body stabilization. I like to disable the IBIS when I'm on a gimbal, just so then I've got one form of stabilization doing the work. Once I take the camera off the gimbal and go back to handheld shooting, flip it back into my handheld setup, custom mode, and I know the IBIS is automatically switched on in line with that custom mode. Therefore, I know I'm good to go and I won't have any wobbly shots because I forgot to disable or enable it when I've moved into or out of the custom mode. I feel like I need a counter for how many times I've said custom mode, but we're probably too late into the video, aren't we now? As a freelance camera operator, you do have so much to think about on a typical everyday shoot. Like I've said in previous videos on this channel, if there's a way to reduce the amount of things to consider during the day without introducing any risk, then we'd be fools if we didn't utilize them. There we go. I hope it hasn't been too long. I hope it's not been too in-depth or confusing. I've tried to do it as quick as possible. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed it. So if you have liked the video, and if this is the first time that you've even watched a video of mine, be sure to subscribe to the channel. If you're an aspiring freelancer or you just want help in being a freelancer in general, that's the purpose of my channel. I want to help others out, share the knowledge and experience that I've been gaining in my first year as a freelancer as well. So if you like the sound of that and you like this video, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If there is any other topics that you'd like me to do a video about, or if you have any questions about custom modes in general, be sure to leave them in the comments below and I will take a look at them and get back to you as soon as I can. And until next time, I'll see you later.